so much there for us to reflect on and focus on the constituency that is the target, the constituency of parliamentarians for our particular session now. Roger, you described really a new architecture, almost an institutional architecture of actors. And in I think it was your penultimate slide where you had so many multiple actors who needed all to engage. It took me back to the central message of the GAR 2020, which was risk is everyone's business. Right. So if it's everyone's business and we're focusing specifically on that group, the constituency of parliamentarians, whose job it is not just to make laws, but also to ensure that they are implemented. And as I started today's session with, the principal focus of the International Day of Parliamentarianism is to enhance public understanding about the role of parliamentarians and how to engage in co-creating those solutions, which is your endpoint, really. Yeah. So how can we step up and address what's missing in this? So I have invited those who wish to have any questions raised or any comments to make themselves known. Please, you can use the raising your hand icon or you can write into the chat. Let's keep the flow going. And I'd like to invite other speakers perhaps to pick up on your challenge. Shuaib, you've studied this for many, many years. What is the weakest link here?
Sorry, Malini, could you repeat the question?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, so I was thinking of the challenges that have been presented. So, Jenty, you had that very long list of questions.
Yes.
Which provoke reflection. And of course, that's what we're trying to do with these provocative sessions, which is really to raise the right questions. And to ask why is what has already been agreed in these multilateral frameworks not being acted on? Where are the weaknesses? We hear a great deal about the weakness of finance. There's no money. It's not the only thing. There are institutional deficits. There are many others. So where would you like to begin? If we want to end with a call for action, what would be the top 3 things that we should be focusing on?
Great. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, my response to that is that is building on and drawing from the several years of research and engagement at multiple scales, from micro to even global level in terms of assessments. What I have noticed and learned, or even unlearned and then later learned, is that there is a lot of capacities and capabilities, but they are disparate and not coordinated in a way that many of the national, regional, and global level discussions actually kind of go on. And so there's a lot of innovations, a lot of solutions by different levels, by communities, by individuals, but they don't feature in many of the discussions, and these do also reflect capacities and capabilities. And yet the dominant discourse is about finance, technical support, and capacity. But there's not been any report or study that I have seen that assesses the so many years of investment in capacity building, whether it's in development or climate change, since AR3, AR4, AR4, with the kind of, if you will, the groundbreaking AR4 on adaptation. I mean, it started with 3, but I think 4 was very clear with its message about the ubiquitous, impact of climate change and need for adaptation. There's not been that much discussion or evaluation of what capacities in different geographies there exist to harness. And the narrative continues to be at the level which talks about there is need for finance, there is need for capacities building, and there's need for technical support. I'm saying this because I think that these 2 kind of pathways could be complementary. Yes, like the vertical upstream, downstream relationship, you could also have a horizontal relationship, and then where they meet, possibly that's where you're most likely going to find the responses needed for addressing systemic risk, because you would be building on what is existing rather than, designing large-scale, bold solutions and ideas or breakthroughs. Because for the last 13 years, we've seen that the discussions happen, but less happens because the good practices that are emerging from below don't feature into the discussion. So that is one point that I would say about where the weakness is. There's need to reevaluate that, rethink that, and be able to mainstream and value the cumulative impact of so many of the multitude of innovations and solutions that we can think of across all the different areas that are being addressed. Secondly, the issue of finance is very important at all levels, and I agree, and everybody acknowledges that the 100 billion is important and needed, but less is being talked about the possibilities to use or to invoke innovative financing mechanisms. For example, for the case of the Global South, what happens if there's a mobilization of finances from the diaspora? What happens if there was a direct promotion, enhancement, and support of micro-level to meso-scale savings, and how those savings can be used to build resilience within livelihood systems, but also other, different development initiatives in the Global South. Again, that is great. There isn't that much literature and knowledge about how that can be done, because the domination of discourse around finance is, oh, we need this much, and it has to be transferred from here to there. I just want to add on that my personal kind of idiosyncratic view about finance and the 100 billion and whatever billion is there. That for me, in many ways, it feels and looks like hollowing the moon, because it's been going on for so long, and there isn't any fruition of the finances getting to where they are needed, and the finances are flowing through established financial markets that do not necessarily work for adaptation and resilience. They may work, and it's good that somebody actually, I think it was Jenty, talked about the green bonds in Mongolia that are specifically on adaptation and not green growth. So green bonds or those financial markets could work for mitigation, but they may not necessarily work for adaptation and resilience building. There's again need for rethinking the different modalities of financing. That is not to say that mitigation is not important again. So again, within IPCC, there's been a lot of discussion about meet and add, or add-meet, adaptation and mitigation, to harness the core benefits and synergies around that. And the special reports, both 1.5 as well as land and climate change, are very clear about that. So to cut the whole story short, those are the 3 points I would raise about what the weaknesses that are that I think of from my experience.
That's very clear. So thank you very much. And of course, this is very pertinent. As Saber was saying, he was in the process of putting together a ministerial statement for the LDC group on finance, and you are challenging the conventional approach to finance and making the case that we have to think much more along far more innovative lines, rather than the traditional way in which we think about finance. And of course, I mean, your point about remittances, we saw what happened with the pandemic, where countries which were highly reliant on remittances from their migrants overseas were impoverished even further. So I think you've set up a number of questions which are quite challenging, and that's precisely what we seek to do, because the whole debate has got to be much more nuanced, much better informed than, as you say in your dramatic words, howling at the moon. How to advance this agenda? In terms of the adaptation challenge, of course, our discussion links very much once again with the global goal on adaptation, which has been set by the Egyptian presidency of COP27. It's one of its key goals as an outcome, to seek clarity on what that would look like, how the global goal itself will integrate the lessons from GAR 2022 have a much more well thought through approach to the integration of risk governance and systemic risk. Jenty, let me bring you in to reflect on the dialogue as it's shaping up from where you're sitting. And I see also while you're collecting your thoughts, of course, but we do have a question here in the chat. Let me invite you to share your thoughts with us, and then I will invite you to please respond to the question in the chat. And if you can't see it, I'll read it out.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you very much, Malini. I think that there's really an incredible opportunity with the midterm review of the Sendai Framework to just take stock for a moment. You know, it's very, very clear that despite incredible progress, despite dramatic falls in mortality, despite incredible investments in early warning systems, despite incredible capacity built in many, many high-risk countries, Vietnam, Philippines, you know, across the board, the examples that Roger pulled out, risk is being created more than it can be reduced. So doing more of the same isn't going to be enough. And at the same time, we've got to twist a little bit how we operate to get, you know, faster, more effective. So I think that there really is an opportunity with the midterm review, but also with the, you know, looking beyond 2030 and also looking at, you know, the writing, if you like, of the adaptation rulebook to put us on a different pathway. Because I think what's really critically important is that, you know, 15 years ago, there were a lot of questions about the how and a lot of questions about what might work and even transferring technology or transferring knowledge was very difficult across a very big globe. What we learned in COVID is that can happen very, very quickly when we need it to. You know, there is incredible capacity. There is incredible learning actually coming out of the global south, which effectively has been, you know, at the coalface for far longer than many other parts of the world. So I think we need to harness that learning, but really bring it into the global systems. And I think that's really also where legislators really need to be at the fore, you know, learning from each other, looking at what works, and then really supporting it to go to scale, because, you know, staying in our comfort zones of silos simply isn't going to work.
Indeed, absolutely. And Shuaib began his presentation with a plea for mainstreaming of these issues. So if we can go to the question which has been raised in the chat, and it calls specifically for recommendations at the level of legislation because of the shortcomings that have been evidenced with some national disaster management agencies where agencies fall short. An example is given in Pakistan. And the next issue, of course, goes back to the need for financial support to fight the disasters year on year. So, Jenty, in your opening slides, you talked about the fact that we would see a doubling of drought episodes by 2030, that we would see a tripling of extreme weather events in this period. So it's not just finding the right sets of interventions, but doing it at scale and fast enough. So your thoughts on the questions and challenges raised in the chat, please. Who would like to go? Roger, should we go back to you?
Can you hear me? Sorry about these. Yes, I'm in. For those of the might not know, I'm actually in Colorado at the moment, so I'm very early in the morning, and so is my iPad apparently. So I think this is such a rich question, and as we think, we have to ask the question that one of my mentors, among many that I've had by the name of Gilbert White, always asked was, why, in spite of knowing so much, aren't we doing better? So I like to show that figure I showed at the very start of my talk, which shows a lot of stuff below the level of the sea in the iceberg, which are not simply emerging risks, they're submerged risks. If the recent ecosystem study IPBES building on the MEA points out that 35 out of 44 of the assessed targets of the SDGs won't be achieved because of negative trends in biodiversity and ecosystems alone, then we have an issue of submerged risk. So to get to this question, let's ask, and you heard some very, very rich points from Shuaib. I was really pleased to hear him mention the AR4 adaptation piece. I was an author of that. The special report on extremes, I was an author of that. Where are we? Where are we in thinking about the link between financing that is better aligned to target the types of risks that we're talking about? You heard a whole lot about here the importance of local capabilities. I work with tribal communities in the US, indigenous peoples. It's not just local knowledge, it's knowledge about the world. And so what I want to get in thinking about this question is the vertical aspects of aligning international global mechanisms as they feed into local resilience. And then the horizontal aspects that Shuaib and others and Jenty mentioned, that parliamentarians could play a strong role in, which is creating the collaborative framework across their agencies to act. Now, I'm not naive about this. I know we all ask for collaboration and coordination, but we all have autonomy and accountability over specific budgets. You don't get credit for collaboration. So unless these efforts are making the case that coordination is needed, then we're not there on getting the financial support to fight disasters each year. Now, I also do want to be just straightforward about this. Disasters occur when societies are overwhelmed, right? That is accumulated over time. It's not just the CO2 issue. It is how we've produced the conditions for disasters by depleting buffers and resources that then do not allow local people the enabling capabilities to act. So I'd like to be very, very clear that it's not one axis saying how do we coordinate the global mechanisms on financing. There's a lot of finance being spent in the wrong place. We need to target it towards the local capabilities and enabling conditions. But we also have to understand that when these events occur, they didn't occur in a vacuum. Yes, they're increasing. I am a recovering climate modeler. I understand the limits and knowledge behind those. In fact, many of the events we're seeing are outside what is being projected because of the nonlinear interactions in the Earth system. But it's also the result of accumulated decisions over time. And if we're not going to pay attention to that, then we're not going to appear to be clear and honest about the drivers of hazards and risk. If we're not clear that we're depleting our environmental buffers and we're reducing people's capabilities in addition to the increasing extremes, then we're not about the actions. From my standpoint, there's getting people around the table, as we talked about, there's multi-hazard early warning systems, there's basically the showing that nature-based solutions actually do work and do work. I mean, Shuaib made a really critical point. They take long to show their value, yet the bang for the buck is greater than any retrofitting that we could do. And the defragmentation of financing vertically, creating a global mechanism that attaches its outcomes to those things. I hesitate to say that it's only the extremes. We've known that is the richness that a DRR view brings to the table. It is the accumulation of risk over time that is then impacted and exacerbated by the extremes. And we have to pay attention to both dimensions and be honest about that. Thanks. No.
Thank you very much. Very sobering. If one takes to heart what you're saying about disasters occur when societies are overwhelmed. Well, I think that's it's a feeling that most people on the planet will be feeling right now, where we have so many perfect storms, very, very complex engagements of different disasters. So if we have a situation where institutions are overwhelmed, how are we building the resilience within institutions? That's adaptive capacity within institutions. You mentioned also, Roger, this is fascinating, that collaboration is not rewarded. So how can we actually create an incentive system, which clearly happened in the case of the Caribbean, with that example that you provided of multiple agencies coming together, recognizing a common risk and creating a new institutional architectural response? Please unmute yourself, Roger. Please unmute yourself. Thank you.
Is that better? Or? That's funny because the sign says microphone off when I do that. So that's anyway. So much for technology. So this is quite the critical problem, right? that in fact, yes, we point to alignment, we point to the need for agility in a changing world, a rapidly changing world, and the idea of adaptability. And yet, when it comes to coordination and collaboration, as Jenty rightly pointed out, we're siloed. But I don't want to throw my hands up at that simply because we're siloed, because laws, financing, and funding actually gear towards the mandates and missions that agencies are supposed to deliver on. So this is not, while we can say this, and I fully agree with the framing on our, we're not creating adaptive systems. And you heard that from Shuaib, and you heard that from Jenty, and from Saber. And the idea here is actually, do we always need, the age-old question, do we always need an event to make us act and work together as humans know how to do? There are two things here. One is a statement about the future, information about the future, and it's unclear how we react and adapt to in things that have not yet happened versus the response to things that have happened. And where we're seeing a gap in financing is thinking about the sovereign liquidity risk, which is right after an event, what can be put into place that gives us long-term responses? We know quite a bit about, you know, we did an economic commission for Latin America. The impacts of COVID-19 on disaster risk reduction and climate change had exactly the points you made, Malini, about the falling apart of remittances during that. Right? So I do want us to be very clear that the actions that we're talking about require coordination and collaboration. We have a pushback in many democratic, anti-democratic societies on doing collective action approaches, and we have to acknowledge and admit to that. And yet, what we're asking from a governance standpoint is the ability to create laws, and I've helped do a little bit of this with the US Congress and with the Caribbean, in which we define the problem and work backwards to see which agency coordinates and inputs to what, rather than asking everybody to coordinate and act together. So who does the monitoring and forecasting, who does the risk assessment, who does the impacts and embedding and planning and preparedness? But you need a central group that aligns those pieces. And this is where the subnational becomes extremely important, not only to feed down, as we like to say, to the last mile, but up from the last meter, to secure and legitimize approaches and innovations that are being done locally. So from my standpoint, you do need some standalone, but it has to be authoritative, and it has to be alignment. It can't subsume the budgets of other agencies.
Thank you very much. On the subnational alignment, of course, that is consistent with one of the objectives of the Sendai Framework. Jenty, if I can come back to you, to the midterm review. What are we learning through the process of the midterm review so far about that interface between the subnational and the national in managing risk and systemic risk in particular?
Thank you so much for the question. And I must admit that the jury is not all in. So I very much encourage those legislators on the call, but also more broadly, you know, to get involved and have your voice heard in the midterm review process, because the series of consultations and the process of different stakeholders feeding back is still ongoing. But I think, you know, what is really coming out is, again, that this issue of consultation and dialogue, it isn't about, you know, educating top down. It's really about learning together. And it's really essential, because the science is not enough. The political will is not enough. If you don't handle the local level understanding, if you don't look at where some of the bottlenecks are, where some of the common challenges are, but also where some of the strengths and the capacities are at the local level, you simply will be off track. And so I think there's some really interesting learning about different ways of consulting, different ways of engaging different stakeholders, really engaging with the people who are often most vulnerable, because they're the ones actually who know the most. They're the ones who have been living this and breathing this. And so I think there's really some interesting learning coming out about that, but also about how networks and social organizations can really accelerate change. You know, if you want to get something taken up, you know, the idea again that you fund it all out of the central government budget, it's nowhere near as effective as creating the kind of social movement that we see, for example, amongst youth or amongst parliamentarians or amongst school teachers that can, you know, take ideas and really build them into the DNA, but also suggest new approaches and new thoughts. So I think there's some really interesting points there. I think there's a lot more to do. And I think, you know, perfecting the way of having these kinds of conversations and also feeding those conversations back into processes in real time so that we can, you know, take that learning to scale. There's more we need to do, but I'm also incredibly heartened because I think there are incredible opportunities in this challenge that, you know, weren't there 15 years ago, and we need to leverage that right now. And I hope that a lot of this will come out in the midterm review and looking at, you know, how resilience can really be in the DNA of the post-2030 agenda, because it simply won't be effective if it's not.
Thank you very much. And Jenty, on those words, I would like to bring our discussions today to a close. We've had a conversation largely amongst ourselves with some input, but of course the idea is for this to remain as a resource also, because we do certainly hope to do something to address that capacity and capability gap that we spoke of. And parliamentarians are a particularly challenging constituency because of the nature of their commitments, relatively under-resourced in comparison to other principal actors. The Sendai Framework, of course, calls for an all-of-state response, institutional response, but many parliaments and, you know, members' offices simply don't have the wherewithal always to engage at the level that they would wish to. So we're in it for the long run. This is quite an effort, but we are delighted to be working with UNDRR and the other parliamentary networks to ensure that the messages which have been so fantastically crafted in the conversation today are then brought to their attention. So we hope that we will use today's dialogue as an input to further capacity building and engagement with parliamentarians, so that we can actually have that all of state, all of society response, and that we can, I would love for us to be able to end this call with a call for legislators and in fact wider public decision makers from all sectors to increase the collaboration between ministries, between the multiple levels of governance at all scales, so that we have risk-informed and environmentally sustainable behavior in public sector decision-making. All four of our speakers today are making singular efforts at improving understanding, presenting data and analysis. And I would like to thank you all for your contributions today. Jenty Kirsch-Wood from UNDRR, Dr. Roger S. Pulwarty from NOAA, Dr. Shuaib Lwasa from ISS, and of course, to the Honorable Saber Chowdhury, who joined us briefly. And I invite for us to please extend our virtual thanks here on this virtual call to all of the speakers. And thank you so much for the participants who joined us today. And we look forward to continuing the dialogue with you. But now, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Have a good day.
Thank you, Malini.
Thank you, Malini. Have a good afternoon.
Cheers.
Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.